Hi everyone, and hi to my fellow panelists, one of whom I think is still joining us. Great, we're all here now, fantastic. So I'm going to kick off. Welcome everyone today who's watching the session. Hope you're having a great and thought-provoking time at this year's ODI Summit. My name is Matt Davies. I'm a senior policy advisor here at the ODI, and I'm lucky enough to be joined today by four great panelists. We've got Alla Morrison, Aaron Franks, Ali Alkhatib, and Professor Ulises Mejias. Before we get into our topic, some housekeeping remarks. Firstly, please use the chat to share thoughts, comments, relevant links, etc. We'll be doing the same, sharing links from our panelists. If you've got any questions for the panelists to answer, please use the Q&A tab on the side rather than the chat tab, because there'll be so much in the chat that questions will get lost. So we'll hope to get to those questions at the end, so please do keep them coming. So the title of this session, People of the World Unite, Challenging Extractive Data Ecosystems. Obviously, the first question really that raises is, what is an extractive data ecosystem? What are the different ways in which a data ecosystem can be extractive? And how does this impact on different groups? So without further ado, I'm going to bring in our first speaker, Alla Morrison, who's a program manager at International Finance Corporation, which is the private sector arm of the World Bank. So Alla, I know you work on strengthening data ecosystems in what we might call traditionally extractive industries, trying to enable citizen participation and better accountability. So I wonder, through that lens and with that experience, if you could shed some light on what we might mean by an extractive data ecosystem.
Well, thank you, Matt. Delighted to be here. I think fundamentally data ecosystem is extractive whenever benefits and risks of public and private intent data are not equitably shared. And especially when people are tricked into data extraction with all sorts of tricks and free goods without understanding the risks. When I think about ways and impacts of extractivism as a concept, I think it's helpful to draw parallels to natural resources. When a foreign oil or mining company used to approach operations in an extractive way, they extracted oil or gold without communities' consent and made profits that they didn't share with local communities. Not only that, they often left those communities worse off with a wide range of negative impacts, destroyed environment, diminished livelihoods, sometimes inflation and social problems. But now there is a way to develop a mining project in a sustainable way that requires free, prior, informed consent of local community, that shares economic benefits through royalties paid to communities, employment, business opportunities for local SMEs, and minimizes social and environmental risks to communities through multi-stakeholder approach, including participatory monitoring, for example. So we at IFC work with mining companies to help them do that. So if we go back to data extractivism, likewise today, there are many technology and big data companies that profit from extracted data without users' consent or understanding of risks and impacts. For example, we know that Facebook generates about $60 per user in the United States. We know that there is a vibrant data brokers market in the US, companies like Axiom, Datalogics, eBureau, and others. So individuals and communities don't really share the profits of these companies or benefit from data insights. But on top of that, they're often left to bear risks which they struggle to fully understand and manage, from privacy violation to being denied a loan or a service because of an extrapolation that a data broker made about them and sold to a bank, for example, in a non-transparent way, making it hard or even impossible for the individual to understand, prove, or appeal. In some cases, these risks can even impact future generations. For example, my child may be denied insurance coverage later in life based on a genetic test that I did with a company like 23andMe. So I'll stop here. Back to you, Matt.
Thanks, Alla. I think that's a really interesting and tangible explanation of what data extractivism might mean and how it impacts on people and communities. I'm going to turn next to our second speaker, Ulises Mejias, who's Professor of Communication Studies and Director of the Institute for Global Engagement at the State University of New York at Oswego. He's also co-founder of the Non-Aligned Technologies Movement and the network Tierra Común. So, Ulises, how would you define data extractivism? Would you build on Alla's definition? Would you take a different approach?
I think, yes, I would like to do that. And I'm very happy to be here in this panel with my co-panelists. But following on what Alla just said, my work, which is co-authored with Nick Coldry, focuses precisely on these similarities and differences between the extraction of natural resources and the extraction of data. Now, we've all heard the cliche that data is the new oil, but I think there is an element of truth to that, except we're not talking about the extraction of a natural resource, obviously, but about this continuous appropriation of data about our lives, as Alla said. And our social activities, our daily activities are basically being converted into zeros and ones and used for the generation of profit. Now, this is basically what we argue in our book, The Costs of Connection, that we are naming a form of data colonialism. And what we're seeing is there's basically a new land grab. Now, in this case, it's not land, it's not natural resources, it's not labor, but it's, like I mentioned, the stuff, the content, the essence of our social lives that is being transformed into data. Now, to use the word colonialism, I think it can be very sensitive, and some people would sort of ask us if that is the right thing to do. We're not establishing a one-to-one comparison between historical colonialism and data colonialism. Obviously, the two kinds of colonialism were and are very different. There are different modes, different scales, different intensities. But what we're arguing is that there is one very important similarity. And that similarity is that the function of those two kinds of colonialism is the same. And that function is to dispossess, to extract. So if we think about it, we see a progression from, I call this the discourse of cheap. We see a progression from cheap nature. In order to colonize the world, the colonizer told us that nature was abundant, it was free, it was just there for the taking. To then we saw cheap labor, the labor that during colonialism had to be abused and oppressed to transform nature into wealth. And now I think we're seeing the same kind of rationality applied to cheap data. Cheap data is again said to be free, abundant, is just there for the taking. So we basically see this progression from the plantation to the factory to the data center. And the last point I'll make is that even though we're all impacted by this new form of data colonialism, it is those populations who have been traditionally oppressed during colonialism and capitalism that continue to pay a heavier price. So this is, the people of color, women, and the poor, they're particularly impacted.
Thanks, Ulises. That's really interesting. And I think we're starting to kind of unpick the ways in which data extractivism is different from, but also similar to other types of extractivism, and the ways in which it impacts on different groups. So now our third speaker, Aaron Franks, is a senior manager for OCAP, which stands for Ownership, Control, Access and Possession, and Information Governance at the First Nations Information Governance Center. So Aaron, please expand. What do you think data extractivism is?
Yeah, thanks very much, Matt, and thanks Alla and Ulises. Just to be straightforward about my positionality here, I do work at the First Nations Information Governance Center that advocates for and supports First Nations interest in information governance and data sovereignty in Canada. But I'm speaking as a staff member there. My views here are not meant to be representative of all First Nations in Canada, although, and indeed we have an international audience here, so I hope my views are added to this conversation and maybe stand in solidarity with Indigenous peoples around the world, but I'm not speaking in a formal capacity, expressing a position here. I think it's important to reflect a little bit on what we're talking about with extraction. And extraction really is, I think, the removal of something without the return of something of like value. So, you know, you stick with the idea of natural resources. We may have remediation. You know, in Canada, we have the tar sands. It's visible from space. It's caused all sorts of environmental problems. There's remediation where the landscape has been sutured over or repaired in some way, but that is not returning like value. That can never replace what was taken from that ecosystem. And it's really about taking without giving. It's about lack of reciprocity. So I think that's important to remember here. I think there's lots of ways that data itself can perform extractive functions. We want to talk about data systems as extractive. It really becomes about form and bundling and the technologies and the structures behind how data is handled and used and distributed. So I can think of 3 ways, or I'm going to offer 3 ways that data systems can be extractive, and they all relate to this idea of format and bundling. One is really the simple packaging and commodification of data sets in ways that become of value to somebody else, not to First Peoples or Indigenous peoples. There are many examples of this in Canada. One example I can think of is the packaging of First Nations peoples' health data to a private corporation, who then in turn sold that data to companies operating in the pharmaceutical industry to do research and development and promoting their products. So that's one very basic example of commodification there. Then I think there's extraction, not of value per se of the data, but extraction of agency or power. And there's, again, lots of examples of that. In the Canadian context, I can think about the over collection of data and the requirement of First Peoples to submit, submit in the most basic sense to government programs, provide your data or you won't receive service X, Y, or Z. Provide this information or we won't fulfill your health claim. The Auditor General in Canada has identified for many years that the federal government overcollects and sits on data extracted from First Nations people and does not use it to improve programming, does not use it to empower communities and governance. So there's an extraction of agency there, as well as value. And I think too, there's an extraction of potential. You know, this is a really contested space. We're here, hosted by the Open Data Institute. These are big conversations. The data ecosystems are not givens, right? They're still in formation. And if First Peoples are excluded from these discussions of the very philosophy of data, the very science of data engineering and data architecture, not just end of pipe uses of data, the value there, but how data is conceived of and used. And I think there's an extraction of potential. And, you know, I'd like us maybe by the end of this conversation to reflect on the role of mediators, data brokers, organizations in the space that bring value to data, that package it, that make it usable. If First Peoples aren't involved at that level, then there's an extraction of potential there too. And I'll leave it at that. Extraction of value, extraction of agency, extraction of potential.
Thanks for that, Aaron. I think that typology is really useful way of thinking about data extractivism, and that's a really powerful message to end on as well. And I hope what we're doing here is trying to kind of, to a certain extent, lift up and platform those voices. So we'll see how successful we are by the end of the conversation. So moving on to our final speaker, last but not least, Alkhatib, who is the Interim Director of the Center for Applied Data Ethics at the University of San Francisco. So Ali, what's your take on data extractivism?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. So broadly speaking, I think of extractive data ecosystems as the systems and the ecosystems that collect data of people without their consent or without their participation, without their autonomy, and without their self-determination about how or where it's used. When we use terms like self-determination or like consent, we're using these terms that we tend not to think of as applying to data science, or at least I tended to not think of as applying to data science. Terms like colonialism, as Ulises did. But we use those terms because that's precisely what we're talking about. We're talking about a lot of the same communities, a lot of the same people, a lot of the same histories of targeting, of exclusion, of omission and surveillance that we've been talking about for the past several hundred years. I also want to sort of point out that also crucial in all of this is how the data are being used, as all the previous panelists have been pointing to. Is the data being used to glean or take knowledge away from the people that you're collecting the data about, or is it to benefit the community? Do these data serve to undermine people's autonomy, people's right to self-determination? And I ask those questions precisely because I don't want you to think whether you're making the lives of these people smoother or easier or whatever, because quite often when you think in that kind of framing, you're implying your own morality as sort of superior to what their, or your own knowledge as superior to what theirs is. And so instead of asking yourself whether you're making your life better by saying like, well, we have better like knowledge of the community or whatever, ask whether you're undermining or empowering their right to determine their futures or their rights to determine their autonomy. And basically to, at the sort of like this underlying level, to ask yourself whether the relationship between the people and the data that represent those people, if those relationships are serving to disempower or serving to empower and to include.
Thanks for that, Ali. That's brilliant. And I really like the kind of dichotomy of empower or undermine. It's a nice heuristic for us to think about, particularly as we go into the next question, which is, what are the alternatives to extractive data ecosystems, and how can people or communities collaborate to bring them about? I'm going to take speakers in order again. If we go in reverse order, so Ali first.
Yeah, so I mean that framing is basically sort of what motivates my thinking on what alternatives exist. When we talk about extractive data systems or extractive data ecosystems as fundamentally being this disempowering power relationship, then the alternative is to try to think of relationships that are empowering, that are inclusive. And a lot of the work that I do tends to focus on thinking about how we can think of data-driven systems like AIs as governance questions, and how we can be participatory and inclusive in the establishing and use of these systems themselves. Sometimes that means that those systems probably shouldn't exist, but I think that much more often it looks like asking ourselves, how can we include the people that are represented in these data in the decisions that are made about how to collect this data, about how to use this data, about whether the system should exist. And all of these sorts of questions are absolutely not things that we as technical workers are exclusively sort of skilled to handle. These are fundamentally questions about the lives of the people that again are represented in these data. So at the core level, my main sort of motivation is to ask, well, how can we include the people that we're talking about in these conversations and in these decisions?
Thanks. I think that's a really important point for us at the ODI here as well. One of the kind of key principles in our manifesto is engagement. We think everyone should be able to engage with and be empowered to participate in technological ecosystems. It shouldn't just be for technologists. So that's a really important point. So Aaron, next. I mean, what do you think of the alternatives?
Wow, I don't really know. But I do want to emphasize the importance of collective rights. The lens of rights is still really important. Often in data discussions around collective benefits, that it's sort of, there's this kind of two different discourses or many different discourses going on. One around possession is sort of that legal sense of what does it mean to possess data these days, digital data, dispersed data sets, and then the other discourse around rights. The rights to benefit, the rights to self-determination. These legal orders don't always rest well with one another from in the Western sense of possession, the Western sense of individualized atomistic rights. I think First Peoples are asserting their collective rights through a lot of different instruments, one of which is the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. There's a long, long way to go to realizing those rights. I know in Canada, the Canadian government is a signatory to UNDRIP and has also passed legislation, Bill C-15, which essentially requires Canadian legislation to be in alignment with the goals of UNDRIP, which would include respecting First Peoples' rights to data sovereignty. So First Peoples' rights to self-determination, development, and crucially, it's mentioned the institutions required to do that, the structures required to do that, are founded also on the need for data sovereignty. Societies need information to operate. Governments need this information to make decisions. So I think there's communities assert those rights, but there's an enormous role for civil society, other aspects of civil society, the private sector, the not-for-profit sector, the academic sector, to learn their role in respecting those rights. The other thing is that First Peoples, of course, much of the burden of change shouldn't fall on First Peoples' shoulders, but to the extent that it does, needing to decide, in the view of this conference, what kind of data people we want to be. What kind of data people do we want to be? And there can be a sense that First Peoples need to be, they need to catch up, or they need to be brought along with the cutting edge of data sciences. I think that's a really destructive way of looking at it. I think the struggles that Ali and Ulises and Alla have all mentioned, particularly in the context of colonialism, these are not yesterday's news. The fact that a government can hold a data set about a group of people and not allow them access to it, that was a problem 50 years ago, and it's a problem now. I don't think we can wish that away with visions of the cloud and people at the Cosmopolitan Center saying things like, "Oh, possession doesn't matter anymore." Well, it does. That said, First Peoples need to be making choices, informing themselves and making choices about the kind of data people they want to be in terms of data architecture, data science, and some of what might be called the quote cutting edge of data.
Thanks. That's really powerful. And on the collective data rights point, I think there's been a belated but welcome shift to certainly in Europe, in the context of data protection law, these things finally started to be talked about in the context of collective rights rather than solely, individual or personalized rights. And I think the indigenous data movement has played a huge part in recognition of that globally. So moving back to Ulises then, for your contribution on, what are the alternatives to data extractivism?
Yes, thank you. And, I really appreciated what Aaron just said. If, in fact, what we're seeing is a new form of colonialism, as Nick, Folge, and I are arguing, then we do have to realize that quick solutions and one-track approaches are not going to work, because we have been basically dealing with this for centuries. So the bad news is that, yes, quick solutions are not going to be easy, but the good news is that there are models and alternatives. I think just at the level of culture and social life, we do have to start thinking about how to decolonize space and time that is captured by these data models. Some of that might be in terms of opting out, reclaiming the space colonized by surveillance cameras, by digital assistants in our bedrooms, in our kitchens, and also reclaiming the time that we spend in front of screens contributing to this system. But that's not going to be enough. I think regulation, obviously, it has already been mentioned, is going to be crucial. I mean, it's amazing to me that if a car manufacturer wants to design and produce a new engine, they know they need to adhere to strict emission controls. But we don't have that yet for algorithms. And I don't think it's that difficult to do. I think basically governments are not, they've been dragging their feet, because obviously putting those emissions controls for algorithms will slow down the profit models of the corporations. We also have very good models for implementing algorithmic impact assessments. So I think that's another thing that we can do. But mostly, I think this is a process that will require great imagination and creativity. I think there we need to learn from past and present decolonial struggles. I'm not suggesting we appropriate them and make them our own. Those struggles have unique, discrete histories, but I think we can learn from them. So that's why, for instance, I'm involved with some of my colleagues in creating networks like Tierra Común or the Non-Aligned Technologies movement. The links were posted in the chat a little bit earlier. So I would invite anyone who's interested in contributing and trying to think through these processes with us to join. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Ulises. And yes, just to flag as well, there have been plenty of links posted in the chat by our chat moderator, Aditya, that corresponds to some of the things that our panelists have been talking about. So please do take a look at those and follow up on them. I'm going to turn to Alla now, but we've got a question in the Q&A, which I think can be kind of usefully linked to this. And it also touches on a point that Ulises made, which is, you know, often when we talk about alternative models to data extractivism, it means it can mean compromising on, you know, profits or efficiency or kind of other things that we might take for granted. So if possible, Alla, if you could kind of speak to that question while answering the more broad point, which is how do we build alternatives to data extractivism, and how do we do so in a way that, you know, how do you keep it from paralyzing use of data that could or should guide good policy or business or collective action?
Yeah, that is a very good question, and I agree with the points that previous speakers made. I want to turn to the World Bank's recent World Development Report on Data for Better Lives that puts forward a framework that I think is helpful for thinking about how to address the extractive nature of data ecosystems. So the WDR states that countries need a well-designed participatory governance framework that is transparent and creates trust, that balances priorities of divergent groups and takes a participatory multi-stakeholder approach to societal convergence on these many challenging issues around data, including data principles, norms, and standards. For example, stakeholders may differ in their views on the principle of data minimization, that is, acquiring only the data necessary to achieve the limited and disclosed purpose for which the data are necessary, as well as participatory approach on discussions on tools and mechanisms to enable responsible systems and tools, and also participation in creating or selecting institutions that are being tasked with extracting maximum public benefit from the data. And I think this goes to the important point that, you know, as a society, you don't want to paralyze the use of data because there is a great economic and social benefit. And if done right, you know, it can bring a lot of value to all. And at the World Bank, there are many programs in this space, you know, Data for Good, where we use, you know, satellite data to, you know, determine poverty rates in new ways or predict future crop yields, etc. So a lot of very good uses of data. And just to go back to the mining sector, I want to mention that IFC now works with companies and governments in countries like Mongolia and Peru at the sector as well as project levels to build companies and governments' awareness of a need for a transparent and equitable data ecosystem, and to build their capacity to engage stakeholders in participatory data mechanisms that can deepen trust and strengthen their social license to operate. For example, we encourage companies to share the data of interest to communities as open data and engage intermediaries, including youth and women in communities, in data analysis and storytelling. Back to you, Matt.
Thanks, Alla. That's really fascinating, and I think it's a nice bridge, you know, with some of those positive examples. To my final question, really, which is a quick fire one for the panel. I should say, by the way, we've had another question in the chat. I don't think we're going to have time to, in the Q&A rather. I don't think we're going to have time to answer. But if possible, it's actually addressed to Aaron. It's about kind of more information on the health data extractivism examples you mentioned. So when we come to you with a quick fire question, perhaps you could indicate where some of those resources might be, or where Naya Kalima can follow up on those examples. But the quick fire question I wanted to ask was simply this. You know, we've been talking about the kind of broader ecosystem and the social context that these practices exist in. But if you were in industry, say if you worked for a big company, what would be the one thing you would do right now to end or reduce data extractivism and those practices? So if you could try and answer that in a sentence or a couple of sentences, please. And if we start with Alla, thanks.
Sorry, did you say Alla or Ali?
Alla.
Okay. Well, first, I think when we speak about industry, it's important to remember that there are different types of companies, some that profit from extracting data as their core business model, such as, perhaps Facebook or a data broker, from those that may not do it at all or may do it occasionally. But if I had to give general advice or call to action, I think sharing the data that companies extract from communities and individuals back with them as open data is a very practical and tangible and easy enough step to do. And because data sets are non-rivalrous goods, they can be consumed over and over without diminishing the original supply. There is a beauty and great source of economic value of data for both the industry and other stakeholders.
Thanks for that, Alla. And I know you need to leave at 15:15, so please do feel free to hop off if you need to. But I'll quickly go to the remaining speakers for the one sentence answer to that. So Ali.
Sorry about that. Yeah, so I think that the thing I would say should motivate a different relationship with the data is to fundamentally reorient towards consent and towards the people that the data reflect, or the people that the data is supposed to represent. I think that quite often when we hear about the very frustrating decisions that companies make that with regard to the collection of data or the solicitation of data, whether it's a large tech company or a sort of small startup that's scraping data off of the internet, quite often it is the result of not respecting the rights or the autonomy or the consent of the people that the data come from. And I think that if you fundamentally change towards that orientation, towards centering consent and that relationship, then I think that it would change the questions that you would ask and certainly change a lot of the answers that you would come to.
Thanks, that's a really good answer. Ulises and then Aaron. And if we could be quick, please, because we're over time. Thank you.
Yes, well, I think it's a difficult question because it basically forces industry to question their business model, and whether it is sustainable, not just profitable. But very quickly, the three things I would recommend. Yes, number one, stop collaborating with governments who are violating human rights. So there were a couple of links posted earlier in the chat for no take for ICE and no tech for apartheid, because unfortunately we do have cases of corporations collaborating with agencies or with the Israeli government to abuse human rights, corporations like Google and Amazon and Microsoft. So that needs to stop. Number two, pay your taxes. Please, corporations. We're talking about great wealth being amassed. The very least I think corporations can do is pay their taxes. And lastly, just help fund public education. I think we do need to do a better job of educating and training the next generations of programmers, designers, legislators, and activists to do a better job. So those are the three things I would recommend.
Thanks for that, Ulises. We're getting a mini manifesto here. And finally, last but not least, Aaron, and I've seen you've shared those resources in the chat, so you're off the hook on that question.
Yeah, really quickly, Ulises, I agree, education, and that has to be to as much extent as possible, no strings attached funding for critical thinking based education at the local and all kinds of levels. First Nations in Canada, there are First Nations institutes, there are existing post-secondary programs, secondary school programs. This is about not just data literacy in terms of statistics and data sets, but around data engineering, the role of data in a shared social benefit. And the second thing I think is be aware of the governance of the territories that you're operating in. If you are operating in New Zealand, that is a treaty. The Maori and the Crown in New Zealand are bound together under treaty, and most of Canada is also under treaty between the Crown and First Nations people. There are obligations there and rights and responsibilities that people, corporations included, need to be aware of.
Thanks, Aaron. Really important points there. And thank you, everyone, for the fantastic discussion. Obviously, Alla has had to go already, but thanks to the rest of you for what's been a really, I've felt, insightful conversation, and I hope our audience have enjoyed it as well. To the audience, yeah, thank you for joining. We hope this has warmed you up to enjoy the topic further. Do look out for kind of future resources from the ODI on this and other topics, in particular our experimentalism and the Fourth Industrial Revolution project, with various work streams, including on data rights in the Global South, may be of interest. And please do join us at other events later on the day and at the Coffee Lounge for networking to continue the conversation. So thank you, and see you soon.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thanks very much. Thank you, Matt, for hosting. Bye-bye.